At the reading of my grandfather's will, the estate lawyer handed me a certified bank check for $50 million. Before I could reach for it, my father snatched it from the table, pulled out his silver lighter, and burned it to ashes right in front of my face. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I simply smiled. What he did not know was that the piece of paper he just set on fire was actually the key to his own survival. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family that underestimated your true worth. My name is Lauren and I am 33 years old. For as long as I can remember, I have been the outsider in my own bloodline. The air inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom in downtown Boston was thick with an icy tension that had nothing to do with the bitter winter wind howling outside the windows. We were gathered on the 45th floor of my father's corporate headquarters, a building that stood as a monument to his ego and relentless pursuit of wealth. My grandfather Theodore had passed away 3 weeks earlier, and this morning was the official reading of his final will. I sat at the far end of the long conference table, perfectly still, maintaining the composed exterior I had spent years perfecting. Across from me sat my father Richard, wearing his bespoke charcoal suit and an expression of profound irritation. He kept checking his expensive watch, signaling to everyone in the room that my mere presence was a terrible waste of his valuable time. Next to him lounged my younger sister Brittany. At 29, she was the undisputed golden child of the family, dressed in a designer outfit that cost more than my first car. She was absent-mindedly swirling a glass of sparkling water, looking incredibly bored by the legal proceedings. At the head of the table sat Mr. Caldwell, my grandfather's longtime estate lawyer and trusted confidant. He was a meticulous man who had faithfully served Theodore for over 4 decades. He methodically arranged a stack of heavy parchment documents before him, clearing his throat to command the room. The initial distribution of minor assets had proceeded exactly as my father had anticipated. Richard received full control over the family's primary holding trust, securing his position at the top of the corporate ladder. Meanwhile, Brittany inherited a lucrative portfolio of commercial real estate properties scattered across the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. They exchanged deeply satisfied glances, entirely confident that the financial hierarchy of our family remained perfectly intact. I had received absolutely nothing so far, a fact which clearly pleased them both immensely. They believed I was finally getting the ultimate punishment for walking away from their toxic dynamic so many years ago. Then Mr. Caldwell paused, his hands hovering over his briefcase. He reached inside the dark leather interior and pulled out a crisp envelope. He opened it with deliberate slowness, extracting a single piece of paper. He looked directly at me, his eyes carrying a heavy weight I could not quite decipher at the moment. He gently slid the document across the polished mahogany surface toward my side of the table. It was a certified bank check made out exclusively to me, Lauren, for the staggering sum of $50 million. For a fraction of a second, the large boardroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the building's ventilation system. I stared down at the bold numbers printed on the thick paper, trying to process the sheer magnitude of my grandfather's final gesture. But before my fingers could even graze the edge of the valuable check, a heavy hand slammed down onto the table. My father reached across the wide table and snatched the check away with alarming speed. His face instantly contorted into a dark mask of pure contempt. "You have no right to sit here, let alone take my father's money," Richard snarled, his voice echoing against the walls. He held the check up in the air, looking at it with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Did you really think you could walk in here and walk out a millionaire? You have never contributed a single useful thing to this family's grand legacy. You are a complete disgrace to my name and everything I have built." I stayed seated, keeping my hands folded neatly and calmly in my lap. I did not flinch even as his toxic anger radiated across the large room. Richard reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a heavy silver lighter he always carried. With an angry flick of his thumb, A bright flame erupted in the dim room. He held the flame directly to the bottom corner of the $50 million check. The thick paper caught fire almost instantly, the flames glowing bright orange and blue. He held it suspended in the air for a few agonizing seconds, making sure I watched the fire consume the printed numbers. Once the heat neared his fingers, he carelessly dropped the burning remains into a heavy crystal ashtray, resting in the exact center of the table. We all sat in complete silence, as the thick smoke curled upward toward the ceiling, leaving nothing behind but a pile of black ash. "Consider your ties to this family officially and permanently severed," he stated, his harsh tone dripping with cruel finality. "Now get out before I have my security team physically throw you out of my building." Brittany leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table. Her perfectly painted lips curled into a vicious smirk. She took a slow sip of her sparkling water before eagerly joining the verbal attack. "Do not cry, Lauren." She laughed, a sharp, condescending sound that grated terribly against my ears. "It is not like you would have the slightest clue what to do with $50 million anyway. You would probably just waste every single penny on another one of your failed little business consultancy projects." She waved her manicured hand dismissively, looking at me as if I were something unpleasant she had just stepped on. "Leave the real money to people who actually know how to run a powerful empire. We are the ones doing the heavy lifting while you just play pretend in the background." She quickly glanced at our father, eagerly seeking his validation, which he immediately granted with a curt nod. They both looked so incredibly triumphant, so entirely convinced of their own brilliant superiority and my absolute defeat. They expected me to burst into tears. They desperately wanted me to beg or scream or break down entirely right there in front of the lawyer. I did none of those things. I leaned back and smiled. I stood up, smoothed my tailored blazer, and brushed some ash from my sleeve. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly composed. "I do not need that check, but you should not have burned it." Mr. Caldwell stood up. His hands were shaking as he looked at my father with terror. "Richard," he said, "that check was drawn directly from your company's commercial liquidity account. By destroying the physical instrument, you froze your operating capital for 45 days. My father's phone began to vibrate frantically with urgent financial alerts. The sharp buzzing of his phone cut through the dead silence of the boardroom like a chainsaw. He scrambled to pull the device from his tailored suit pocket, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped it onto the polished mahogany table. His thumb swiped across the illuminated screen, and I watched the remaining color drain from his face. A harsh automated chime signaled a notification, followed by another, and then another. The bank was moving fast. Mr. Caldwell had not been exaggerating. By destroying that physical certified check, my father had triggered an automated fraud and liquidity protocol within the commercial banking system. I knew what those notifications meant because I had spent years studying the compliance software his bank utilized. His credit lines were freezing one by one, locking up millions of dollars in operating capital. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, and pushed my leather chair back into its place. My father was hyperventilating now, tapping his screen with frantic fingers, muttering under his breath about margin calls and payroll processing. Brittany had dropped her glass of sparkling water. The crystal shattered against the hardwood floor, sending water and shards of glass everywhere. But nobody looked down to acknowledge the mess. I turned my back on them and walked toward the doors. The sound of my heels clicking against the floor felt like a steady drumbeat. I did not look over my shoulder. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway, leaving the suffocating panic of my toxic family behind me. The air out here felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my chest. I took a deep breath, letting the tension of the past hour leave my lungs. For 33 years, I had walked these halls feeling like an imposter, treated like a disappointment, because I refused to play by his ruthless rules. They had spent a decade mocking my preservation business, calling it a charity project, and treating my desire for financial independence like a disease. Now the walls of their empire were shaking, and I was the only person walking away unscathed. I headed toward the bank of elevators at the end of the corridor, pressing the down button. Before the arrival chime could sound, the pounding of footsteps echoed against the carpet behind me. The boardroom door slammed shut, and an angry voice rang out down the corridor. It was Cameron, my sister's husband. He had always been the ultimate opportunist, a man who married into the family wealth because he lacked the spine and intellect to build his own life. He marched down the hall, his face flushed red with a mixture of misplaced rage and sudden financial desperation. He stepped directly between me and the closed elevator doors, throwing his arm across the metal frame to block my exit. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting wildly around the hallway as he tried to assert a physical dominance he had never earned. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, his voice dropping into a harsh hiss. "You are not going anywhere until you go back inside and fix this mess," he demanded. "Your father is in there losing his mind. The bank is halting all outgoing wire transfers as we speak, which means the funding for my new commercial development project is locked up. You need to call the bank manager right this second and tell them it was a simple family misunderstanding." I simply looked at him, completely unfazed by his desperate attempt at intimidation. "I do not work for your commercial bank, Cameron," I replied in a perfectly even tone. "And I certainly do not work for you or anyone else in that boardroom." He scoffed loudly, stepping one pace closer, foolishly attempting to use his height advantage to intimidate me. "You have always been nothing but a parasitic leech, Lauren," he spat out. "You refused to join the family business when we needed you. You refused to put in the grueling hours required to build this corporate empire. You just sit around playing with your little architectural preservation projects, while the rest of us do the real work. You have dragged our reputation down for years, and now you are trying to bankrupt the very people who put a roof over your head." I did not flinch, allowing him to expose the full depth of his entitlement and delusion. He was entirely blind to the reality of who actually held the power in the situation. "If you are not going to call the bank and fix this immediately, then you are going to compensate us right now for the damage you caused." Cameron continued, his voice rising in panic. "Hand over the master keycard to the Aspen Ski Lodge. My father-in-law just explicitly told me to come out here and take it from you. We are putting the property up for collateral this afternoon to secure an emergency bridge loan until this ridiculous banking freeze is fully sorted out. Give me the card right now." The Aspen Ski Lodge. The mere mention of the property brought back a flood of painful memories. It was a property nestled in the snowy mountains, a place my family had aggressively utilized for years to host corporate retreats and impress foreign investors. They had stopped inviting me to the lodge over a decade ago. Brittany had once told me my plain clothes and quiet, observant demeanor ruined the aesthetic she was desperately trying to project to her socialite friends. They treated that property like their own private, untouchable kingdom, utilizing it as a powerful symbol of their elite social status. Cameron held out his open palm, snapping his fingers impatiently. "Do not even try to play dumb with me today," he barked, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "I know for an absolute fact you carry a master magnetic keycard in your bag for emergencies. Hand it over this instant, or I will gladly have the building security team hold you right here against this wall until the police arrive to arrest you for corporate sabotage and financial extortion." I maintained my calm composure. I slowly reached down and unclasped my leather handbag. I reached into the side pocket and pulled out the solid black magnetic keycard. Cameron smirked, a repulsive look of arrogant satisfaction washing over his flushed face. He genuinely thought he had finally won. He truly believed that his aggressive bullying had successfully intimidated me. He thought I was finally backing down, reverting instantly to the submissive and silent scapegoat they had always expected me to be. I held the black card up in the air, pinching it between my index and middle fingers. There was a tall stainless steel trash can resting against the polished marble wall next to the elevator bank. Without breaking my steady eye contact with Cameron, I shifted my wrist outward and dropped the heavy keycard straight down. It hit the cold bottom of the empty metal bin with a remarkably loud hollow clang that echoed sharply down the quiet corridor. "You can have it, Cameron," I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm, clear and steady. "But you should probably know I sold the lodge yesterday. Grandpa put it in my name 5 years ago. It was a detail you all ignored because you assumed I was too stupid to read the deeds. Cameron stood frozen in the hallway, his mouth hanging open as he processed the reality of the empty trash bin and the lost ski lodge. The elevator chimed behind me. The steel doors slid open silently. I stepped inside, turned around, and pressed the button for the executive parking garage. As the heavy doors glided shut, cutting off the sight of Cameron's red face, I let out a slow breath. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet hum of the elevator steady my heart rate. For my entire adult life, I had dreaded stepping foot inside this glass skyscraper. Every family visit was a painful reminder of my inadequacy in their eyes. They had spent a decade tearing down my confidence, treating my preservation business as a charity project, and mocking me. Now the descent felt like a quiet victory lap. I had simply let their own arrogance spring the trap my grandfather carefully laid. The elevator eased to a halt, and the doors opened into the cavernous expanse of the underground parking garage. The thick concrete walls were washed in harsh fluorescent light that cast long shadows across the designated executive parking zone. The air down here was cold, smelling faintly of engine oil and exhaust fumes. My heels clicked rhythmically against the smooth concrete floor as I walked toward the VIP pickup area. I had arranged for a chauffeured car to meet me, knowing I would not want to linger around the corporate headquarters once the will reading concluded. I pulled my phone from my purse to check the driver's location tracker. He was turning onto the street above 2 minutes away. I stopped near a massive concrete pillar, wrapping my dark wool blazer tighter around my shoulders against the subterranean chill. The heavy silence of the garage was quickly broken by the sharp sound of rapidly approaching footsteps. I did not even have to look up from my phone screen to know who was coming toward me. The aggressive clicking of designer stilettos, striking the concrete, gave her identity away instantly. My mother Patricia rounded the corner with a reckless speed that betrayed her usual carefully cultivated high society elegance. Her perfectly styled blonde hair shifted wildly around her shoulders, and her manicured hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. She marched directly toward me, her eyes flashing with a toxic mixture of blind panic and pure rage. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat that swept behind her like a cape, a stark contrast to the dark, furious expression contorting her face. Normally, Patricia would never be caught dead in an underground parking garage, preferring the pristine lobbies of the upper levels. Her presence down here meant the panic upstairs had reached a boiling point. Before I could even offer a greeting, Patricia closed the final distance between us. Without a single word of warning, she raised her right hand and struck me violently across the left side of my face. The slap was shockingly loud. It was a sharp, cracking sound that echoed off the thick concrete walls and low ceiling of the empty garage. The physical impact snapped my head forcefully to the side. Her heavy diamond ring scraped painfully against my skin. A hot, intense stinging sensation bloomed instantly across my cheekbone, radiating downward through my jawline. I tasted a faint, metallic hint of copper in my mouth, where my teeth had caught the inside of my lower lip. The physical shock was intense, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I did not raise my hand to soothe the burning sting on my cheek. I simply stood my ground and looked at her, maintaining a steady, unblinking gaze that unsettled her. Patricia was breathing heavily, her chest heaving under her coat, her eyes wild with desperation. "You are going to pull out your phone right now," she commanded, her voice trembling with raw fury. "You are going to call the banking executives, and you are going to fix the monumental financial mess your father just walked into. I do not care what lies you have to tell them, but you will unfreeze his commercial accounts this very second. Then you are coming straight back upstairs to Mr. Caldwell's office, and you are signing a legal waiver relinquishing any and all residual estate rights. You are going to sign away every last claim you have. You are not walking away with a single penny of your grandfather's money, Lauren. Do you hear me?" I stared at her, marveling quietly at the delusion it took to make those ridiculous demands after physically assaulting me. "You always do this." Lauren Patricia continued, her voice rising in pitch as she began to pace a tight, agitated circle in front of me. You always have to ruin everything for this family. You are so entirely consumed by your own petty jealousy that you cannot stand to see anyone else succeed. You have been this deeply vindictive since you were a child. Do you remember Brittany's wedding? You completely humiliated us. You outright refused to pay for the custom imported floral arrangements when your sister was counting on your contribution. You knew perfectly well we needed that specific floral designer to impress Cameron's wealthy family, and you stubbornly held on to your savings account just to spite her. You ruined the aesthetic of her entire reception. Patricia stopped pacing and pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. And now you are trying to ruin her all over again. Your sister is trying to close a massive real estate merger this weekend. It is the single most important deal of her career. She needs the family's financial backing to secure the final acquisition phase. If your father's accounts remain frozen, the entire merger falls apart. Brittany will lose millions of dollars and our family reputation in the commercial sector will be destroyed. Stop being a selfish brat and fix this immediately. I let her harsh words hang in the cold, damp air of the garage. I slowly raised my hand and gently touched my burning cheek. It was throbbing, likely leaving a bright red mark across my skin, but I felt absolutely nothing inside. The years of desperate longing for my mother's affection had finally evaporated, replaced entirely by a cold, impenetrable armor. A sleek black chauffeured car rounded the concrete corner and pulled smoothly to a stop just a few feet away from us. The uniformed driver immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me. I looked at Patricia, offering her a calm, polite smile that made her flinch. "I cannot fix a fire that Dad started with his own two hands," I said softly. "And I am certainly not signing away anything that legally belongs to me." I turned my back on her and stepped into the plush leather interior of the waiting vehicle. Before the driver could close the door, a loud automated chime erupted from Patricia's designer handbag. She froze, digging frantically into her purse to pull out her smartphone. I sat back in my seat, watching through the tinted glass as she read the notification. The bank was not just freezing Richard's corporate accounts. They were officially initiating immediate foreclosure proceedings on Patricia's beloved suburban mansion. The color completely vanished from her face. The driver firmly pushed the car door shut, silencing her sudden terrified gasp. The heavy car door sealed shut behind me, cutting off the sharp sound of my mother gasping for air in the cold parking garage. I leaned my head against the soft leather headrest and instructed my driver to head toward the financial district. My phone remained completely silent. I had blocked their numbers the moment the elevator doors closed on Cameron. I knew exactly where my father would go next. When cornered, Richard resorted to the easiest source of capital he thought he could control. Across town, Richard was practically sprinting through the revolving doors of Boston Heritage Private Wealth Management. The grand lobby was a sprawling expanse of imported Italian marble, towering Roman columns and vaulted ceilings painted with intricate frescoes. Richard ignored the espresso bar and marched directly toward the heavy mahogany desk of the senior branch manager. His charcoal suit was slightly wrinkled now. He was out of options. The 45-day freeze on his commercial liquidity account had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. His creditors were circling like hungry vultures. Patricia had called him screaming about the foreclosure notice on their suburban mansion. Cameron was bombarding him with furious messages about the ruined real estate merger. Richard needed immediate, untraceable cash to secure a bridge loan. He firmly believed he had the perfect solution sitting dormant in a trust account. My grandmother, a woman who had seen through Richard long before anyone else, had established a private trust exclusively in my name before she passed away. Richard had tried to gain control of it for years. He had hired lawyers, contested the wording of the estate, and bullied trustees, but the account remained completely locked behind my signature. Today, however, he was not relying on legal maneuvering. He was relying on pure fraud. "Mr. Sterling." The senior branch manager looked up from his computer monitor as my father barged into his private glass-walled office. Sterling was a meticulously groomed man in his late 50s, known for his absolute discretion and strict adherence to protocol. Richard did not wait for an invitation to sit. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase onto the glass desk and collapsed into one of the plush visitor chairs. "Arthur, I need your immediate assistance with a delicate family matter." Richard began, his voice thick with manufactured grief. "It is regarding my daughter Lauren. I am afraid we have reached a severe crisis point with her condition." Mr. Sterling steepled his fingers, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. "I am very sorry to hear that, Richard. How can the bank be of service today?" Richard reached into his briefcase and produced a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them across the smooth glass surface. My father had spent the last 2 hours having his personal lawyers forge a comprehensive power of attorney. The document was designed to grant him absolute, unrestricted access to my grandmother's dormant trust fund. Lauren is mentally unfit to manage her own finances. She has suffered a complete psychological collapse. She is confused, erratic, and currently posing a severe danger to herself and the family business. We are taking steps to have her placed in a long-term care facility this afternoon. In the meantime, I need to assume immediate control of her trust account to cover her medical expenses and secure her future. It was the exact same lie he had used to destroy my reputation when I was 22 years old. Back then, I had discovered that Richard was quietly siphoning money from my college tuition fund to pay for Brittany's lavish vacations. When I confronted him directly, he did not apologize once. Instead, he launched a vicious smear campaign across our entire extended family and his influential social circle. He claimed I was a college dropout who refused to attend class as a troubled girl who spent her days locked in her room hallucinating. He ruthlessly told all of my aunts and uncles that I needed institutionalizing, isolating me so thoroughly that no one believed a single word I said about his theft. Mr. Sterling picked up the documents and adjusted his reading glasses. He flipped through the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the forged signatures and the fake notary stamps. The pressure of his frozen corporate accounts was making him reckless. He needed this transaction to process immediately. "This is a very serious situation," Mr. Sterling said quietly, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the paperwork. "I am sure you understand the strict security protocols we must follow to protect our clients." "I understand perfectly, Arthur," Richard replied, flashing a tight, impatient smile. "But time is of the essence here. Lauren is completely incapacitated. I have provided all the necessary legal documentation. The signatures are verified. The notary seal is present. I need you to authorize the transfer of those funds into my primary holding account right now." Mr. Sterling slowly lowered the documents back onto his desk. He typed a sequence of numbers into his keyboard. "I need to run this through our internal verification system, Richard. It will only take a brief moment." Richard exhaled a shaky breath of relief, leaning back in his chair. He truly believed he had won. He thought his status and his forged paperwork had successfully bypassed the bank's security measures. He thought he had outsmarted me once again. Mr. Sterling stared at his computer monitor. A small red alert box had just popped up on his screen. Mr. Sterling read the text carefully. He did not say a word. He simply lowered his right hand below the surface of his heavy glass desk. His fingers found a small hidden button mounted underneath the wood paneling. He pressed it silently. A soft mechanical click echoed through the grand lobby outside. The heavy glass doors at the main entrance of the bank slid shut and locked automatically. Thick steel security bolts engaged with a heavy thud, sealing the entire building. Richard frowned, turning his head to look out through the glass walls of the office. What was that noise? Is there a problem with the doors? Mr. Sterling folded his hands neatly on his desk and looked directly into my father's eyes. The polite, accommodating customer service smile was completely gone from his face. "There is no problem with the doors, Richard. They are functioning exactly as intended." My father stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "What are you talking about? Authorize the transfer. I gave you the legal documents." "Those documents are entirely worthless," Mr. Sterling stated, his voice dropping to a serious, uncompromising tone. "That trust account was never dormant. Your daughter Lauren transferred the bulk of those funds to an external holding company 3 years ago. What she left behind was a highly monitored, legally bound honeypot trap. She instructed this bank to flag any individual who attempted to access the account using forged documentation. She warned us you might claim she was mentally unfit. Richard stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of the visitor chair. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. By presenting this forged document today, you have just committed a severe federal offense, Mr. Sterling continued calmly, his eyes narrowing at the trapped man. The silent button I pressed did not simply lock the front doors. It directly alerted the Financial Crimes Division of the local police department. They are already on their way here right now to arrest you. While Richard sat frozen in panic waiting for the authorities, I was miles away methodically reviewing the final stages of a much larger operation. My workspace was located on the third floor of an unassuming brick building in a quiet industrial park. The room was aggressively plain, featuring beige walls, a scuffed floor, and a simple metal desk. It was the exact opposite of the corporate kingdom my family worshipped, making it the perfect place to conduct business without drawing unwanted attention. The door to my office suddenly swung open. My sister Brittany marched into the room bringing a cloud of heavy designer perfume. Wearing a tailored white pantsuit, she paused inside the doorway, her eyes scanning the drab surroundings with profound horror. "I had to pull a dozen strings just to find out where you were hiding, Lauren," she said, her voice dripping with genuine disgust. "Looking at this place, I see you have really hit rock bottom. I almost feel sorry for you." She approached my desk, crossing her arms and looking down at me with a practiced look of pity. "We need to talk about Dad," she announced. "I know he made a mistake at the bank this morning, but you are blowing this out of proportion. The police are holding him in custody for federal fraud. You need to call the authorities right now and tell them it was all a big misunderstanding." "He did not make a mistake, Brittany," I said calmly. "He forged a legal document and attempted to steal millions of dollars. That is a crime." Brittany rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. You are being entirely too dramatic as usual. He is our father. He was just trying to secure emergency funds because you selfishly froze his capital. He was trying to save our empire. He was trying to save himself," I corrected her, "and he chose to do it by committing fraud. The consequences belong entirely to him." Brittany reached into her pristine white handbag. Slapping a checkbook onto my metal desk, she scribbled a number, signed her name with a flourish, and ripped the check from the binding. She slid the piece of paper across the desk. It was a personal check made out to me for $10,000. "Take the money, Lauren," she commanded, her voice softening into mocking compassion. "You have always worn my hand-me-down, so you might as well take my charity now. You clearly need it more than I do. Just take the $10,000 and drop these ridiculous fraud charges against our father." I stared at the check, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction wash over me. She truly believed that $10,000 was a life-changing amount of money for me. She was completely blinded by her own arrogance. "Think about it, Lauren," she urged in a conspiratorial whisper. "You could use this money to finally get a decent apartment. All you have to do is make one simple phone call to the police and tell them to let Dad go. Our family avoids a humiliating public scandal." I slowly picked up the check. $10,000. A drop in the bucket compared to the empire they had built on my grandfather's money. "You really think this is going to fix everything, do you not?" I asked softly. "You think you can throw a few scraps my way and expect me to play dead?" Brittany straightened her posture, her fake sympathy hardening into cold irritation. "Do not be ungrateful, Lauren. I am trying to save our family from your destructive tantrums. You have caused enough damage for one day. The Aspen Lodge is gone. Dad is in a holding cell and my real estate merger is hanging by a thread because of the financial freeze you caused. I am throwing you a lifeline. Take it and be quiet." I placed the check back down on the desk and pushed it slowly toward her. "Keep your money, Brittany. I do not need your charity, and I certainly do not want your hand-me-downs." Her face flushed with sudden intense anger. She slammed her hand against the desk. You are making a massive mistake. You have absolutely nothing. You are a nobody working in a pathetic little room. When Dad gets out of this, he is going to crush you. We are going to make sure you never work in this city again." Before I could respond, the heavy wooden door to my office opened once more. My assistant, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman named Sarah, stepped into the room. She ignored Brittany entirely, walking straight to my desk with a thick leather-bound folder in her hands. She placed the folder gently on the desk, right next to Brittany's rejected check. "The final acquisition contracts are ready for your signature, Madam CEO." Sarah said, her voice crisp and professional. "The legal team has verified all the operational transfers and the wire protocols are queued for your authorization." "Thank you, Sarah," I replied smoothly. "Please wait outside. We are almost finished here." Sarah nodded respectfully and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Brittany stood frozen, her eyes darting between me and the closed door. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The arrogant confidence had vanished from her face, replaced by deep, unsettling confusion. "Madam CEO." Brittany repeated the words, sounding foreign and wrong on her tongue. What is she talking about? What is this place? I reached out and opened the thick leather folder. The crisp white pages inside were covered in dense legal text and complex financial charts. I turned the folder around so it faced Brittany, allowing her to read the bold header printed across the top of the first page. "This plain, depressing little office is just a temporary satellite branch, Brittany," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly calm and measured. "It serves as a secure off-the-radar location for high-level negotiations. The main headquarters for my company is located in New York, but I prefer to handle sensitive acquisitions personally." I tapped the top of the document with my index finger. "Vanguard Holdings. I built it from the ground up over the past 10 years. We are a crisis management and hostile acquisition firm. We specialize in identifying over-leveraged, poorly managed companies and dismantling them for their core assets." Brittany leaned forward, her eyes scanning the document. I watched her read the name of her own company, printed in bold letters on the acquisition contract. Her breath hitched a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in the quiet room. Her hands began to tremble as the reality of the document slowly registered in her mind. "Your real estate merger is not hanging by a thread, Brittany. Your merger is completely dead. Your potential partners pulled out the second they heard about Dad's frozen accounts. You have been operating on borrowed capital for years, relying entirely on Richard to cover your massive corporate debts. Without his money, your company is functionally bankrupt." I picked up my silver pen and clicked it open with a satisfying snap. "Vanguard Holdings aggressively purchased every single one of your outstanding commercial debts an hour ago. We are now your primary secured creditor, and this contract right here is the finalized paperwork authorizing the complete and total acquisition of your failing real estate company. You are going to sign it, or we are going to force you into immediate liquidation by the end of the day." Brittany stared at me, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. She looked from the $10,000 check she had offered me as a bribe down to the multi-million-dollar acquisition contract that signaled her absolute ruin. She finally realized she was not standing in the office of a pathetic, destitute sister. She was standing in the den of a predator who had just swallowed her entire world whole. Brittany reached out with a trembling hand, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering over the thick stack of acquisition papers. She looked as though she wanted to tear the contract to pieces to somehow undo the ink and the legal binding that effectively erased her entire career. I calmly placed my palm flat against the document, pinning it securely to the metal desk. Our eyes met, and the sheer panic radiating from her gaze was almost palpable. She snatched her hand back as if the paper had burned her skin. Without another word, she spun on her heel and practically ran for the door. She bumped her shoulder against the doorframe in her haste, her white cashmere coat catching on the metal latch, but she did not even pause to fix it. I listened to the frantic, uneven clicking of her stilettos echoing down the hallway, growing fainter, until the heavy stairwell door slammed shut. The silence that settled over my plain office was deeply satisfying. I leaned back in my chair, picked up the $10,000 check she had so arrogantly slapped onto my desk, and stared at her messy signature for a brief second before I carefully fed it into the paper shredder beneath my feet. The machine hummed to life, reducing her pathetic bribe to a pile of worthless ribbons. I knew my sister well enough to know she would not retreat quietly. Brittany had never lost gracefully in her entire life. When backed into a corner, she always resorted to public performance, using her carefully curated social circle to wage war on her behalf. I simply had to wait for her to make her next move. I did not have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, the screen of my phone illuminated with a rapid succession of notifications. They arrived in a relentless wave buzzing against the hard surface of my desk. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen, watching as alerts from LinkedIn, Facebook, and various industry forums flooded my feed. Brittany had launched her counterattack. I tapped on the first notification, opening a lengthy, tearful post Brittany had just published across all her professional and personal channels. She had attached a photo of herself, looking distressed but resolute, standing in front of our family headquarters. The text beneath the photo was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. She claimed that a predatory corporate raider was currently attempting to extort our proud, historically significant family business. She named me directly, stripping away any pretense of privacy. She wrote that I was ruthlessly taking advantage of a temporary liquidity issue to bankrupt the very people who had raised me. Then came the most venomous lie of all. Brittany typed out a heart-wrenching paragraph claiming that our father Richard was suffering from rapidly declining mental health and that I was maliciously exploiting his vulnerable cognitive state to steal the family assets. She completely flipped the narrative, projecting Richard's exact strategy against me onto him to garner public sympathy. She begged her network of wealthy investors and real estate partners to stand with her against this disgusting display of corporate extortion. The comments were already rolling in by the hundreds. Industry peers, socialite friends, and rival executives were offering their prayers, their outrage, and their unwavering support for the poor, victimized Caldwell family. Before I could even finish reading the first wave of sympathetic comments, my private messages began to explode. The extended family group chat, a digital space I had muted for years but never officially left, suddenly flared to life. My phone vibrated endlessly in my palm as the messages poured in from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had never bothered to check on me during my lowest moments. Now they were unified in their absolute disgust. Uncle Robert was the first to attack, typing in all capital letters that I was an ungrateful parasite who was trying to send my own father to an early grave. Aunt Susan followed immediately behind him, claiming she was physically sickened by my actions. Then came the inevitable comparisons, the dredging up of the fake history my mother had so carefully planted all those years ago. Cousin Olivia posted a massive block of text, her words dripping with self-righteous anger. She wrote that I had not changed one bit since I was a teenager. She told the entire group that this extortion attempt was exactly like the time I stole Patricia's priceless diamond necklace to pawn for drug money. That was the lie my mother had invented when I was 19. When Patricia realized I was saving money to move out and escape her control, she panicked. She hid her own jewelry, called the police, and told the entire extended family that I was a thief and an addict. She used that completely fabricated story to kick me out of the house, with nothing but the clothes on my back, ensuring that no one in the family would ever offer me a couch to sleep on or a dime of support. They had all believed Patricia's malicious lie without a single question, and they were eagerly using it now as indisputable evidence to validate Brittany's desperate, flailing smear campaign. The group chat became a feeding frenzy. They called me a disgrace, a criminal, a bitter outcast who was trying to tear down a beautiful empire out of sheer jealousy. They demanded that I drop my claim against Brittany's company, immediately threatening to pool their resources to hire the best litigators in the country to destroy me. They promised to make sure my name was absolute poison in the business world. I sat at my desk and watched the vitriol fill my screen, feeling an incredible sense of calm. Years ago, reading these messages would have sent me into a panic attack. I would have drafted paragraphs of desperate defense, begging them to listen to the truth, pleading with them to see reason. Now I did not feel the slightest urge to argue with their delusions. I did not type a single word of defense. Instead, I minimized the messaging application and opened my secure company drive. I navigated through the deeply encrypted folders until I found the specific legal document I needed. It was a comprehensive, ironclad certificate issued by the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I downloaded the file, attached it to the family group chat, and hit send. I did not include a greeting or an emotional plea. I simply typed one single factual sentence beneath the attached file. I informed them that Vanguard Holdings had legally purchased and trademarked the Caldwell family corporate name, their commercial likeness, and all associated branding assets exactly 3 hours before Brittany published her post. The chat went completely dead in a matter of seconds. The rapid-fire stream of vicious insults ceased instantly, leaving a deep, unsettling silence in its wake. I smiled to myself, imagining the collective realization slowly washing over them as they opened the document and carefully read the binding legal terms. By using the family's corporate name to launch a massive public smear campaign against my company, Brittany had not just thrown a tantrum. She had committed a massive, highly actionable trademark violation on a completely public platform. And every single family member who had shared her post, retweeted her absurd claims, or used the trademarked name to defame my corporate entity was now legally liable for catastrophic financial damages. The silence that followed my message was not just digital. It felt as though a massive vacuum had sucked the air out of the entire city. I sat at my metal desk and watched the read receipts tick upward. One by one, my aunts, uncles, and cousins opened the attached file. I could vividly picture them sitting in their lavish living rooms, staring at their screens as the terrifying realization washed over them. They were no longer dealing with the quiet, submissive girl they had bullied for years. They had just publicly defamed a ruthless corporate entity with the unassailable legal right to seize their personal assets in damages. Within 5 minutes, Brittany frantically deleted her original post. 10 minutes later, every shared article and hateful comment vanished from my extended family timelines. But the internet is forever, and my dedicated legal team had already archived every single keystroke. The real retaliation did not arrive until late that afternoon. Sarah knocked softly on my office door and walked in holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. It had been hand-delivered by a private courier. I recognized the embossed gold logo in the corner immediately. It was from my father's high-priced corporate legal team. I sliced the envelope open and pulled out a heavy stack of paper. It was a formal cease and desist order wrapped in aggressive, threatening legalese. Richard was operating on borrowed time in pure, desperate bravado. The letter demanded that I immediately relinquish the trademark, drop the acquisition of Brittany's failing real estate firm, and personally intervene to unfreeze his commercial banking accounts. If I refused to comply within 24 hours, his lawyers promised to bury me in court for the rest of my natural life. They threatened to tie up Vanguard Holdings in so much frivolous litigation that my company would slowly bleed out from exorbitant legal fees. The final page of the document demanded an immediate mandatory mediation call. Richard desperately wanted to flex his diminishing power. He wanted to hear my voice tremble. He wanted to corner me the way he had done when I was a helpless child. I smiled, a genuine feeling of deep anticipation warming my chest. I picked up my office phone and dialed the direct line for Mr. Caldwell. My grandfather's former estate lawyer had officially transitioned to acting as my primary legal counsel earlier that week. He was a brilliant, meticulous man who despised my father just as much as I did. I read the ridiculous demands to Mr. Caldwell over the phone. He let out a dry, rattling chuckle that conveyed his complete lack of concern. He advised me to accept the call and told me he would handle the necessary preparations from his secure office. We scheduled the mandatory mediation for exactly 4 o'clock that afternoon. When the time came, I walked down the hall and stepped into the secure conference room. The space was deliberately sparse, featuring only a long wooden table and a high-tech teleconferencing system. I took a seat in the comfortable leather chair at the head of the table. Sarah brought me a glass of iced water and quietly shut the door, leaving me completely alone in the soundproof room. At exactly 4 o'clock, the conferencing system chimed loudly. I reached forward and pressed the flashing button to connect the line. Mr. Caldwell was already waiting on the secure network, his breathing steady and calm over the speakers. A moment later, a sharp, angry beep signaled that Richard and his entire legal team had joined the call. Lauren, my father barked, not bothering with a basic greeting or any standard professional courtesy. His loud voice echoed harshly through the speaker, thick with arrogant condescension. I hope you have carefully read the legal documents my team sent over. You have played your little game today, and I will gladly admit the trademark trick was a decent parlor trick. But the foolish game is officially over now. You are going to sign the release forms, and you are going to back down immediately. If you do not, I promise you that I will personally see to it that you spend the next 30 years buried in agonizing deposition hearings. I took a very slow, deliberate sip of my ice water. I did not say a single word. My total silence only seemed to infuriate him further. You think you are so incredibly smart because you built this pathetic little crisis management firm? Richard sneered. You truly think you can sit in your cheap office and outmaneuver the massive empire I built? You have always been completely delusional, Lauren. You have always thought you were somehow better than this family. You honestly think I cannot destroy Vanguard Holdings just as easily as I destroyed your very first startup right out of college? I gripped the smooth edge of the wooden table. The sudden memory hit me like a physical blow to the chest. When I was exactly 22 years old, I had launched a small independent architectural preservation firm. I had worked day and night to secure a massive municipal contract that would have put my tiny company on the map. The night before the contract was supposed to be signed, the city abruptly canceled the entire deal. My financial investors panicked and instantly pulled their funding. My company completely collapsed within a single week. I had always suspected Richard had something to do with it, but I could never actually prove it. Now his desperate need to exert absolute dominance was making him confess. Do not think I do not know how to handle you, Richard boasted, his voice rising in volume as he fed on his own perceived power. I made absolutely sure the city council rejected your little charity project 10 years ago. I made 2 simple phone calls, and I successfully crushed your company before it even got off the ground. I did it to teach you a vital lesson about knowing your place. You were a naive, ungrateful college dropout who needed to learn that you cannot survive in the real world without my money and my protection. I put you exactly where you belonged back then, and I will happily do it again today. I will crush Vanguard Holdings into dust, Lauren. I will take everything you have ever built, and I will leave you begging for a minimum wage job in my mailroom. He paused, breathing heavily into the sensitive microphone. He was waiting for me to cry. He wanted me to beg and apologize just like I always did when I was a teenager. I slowly leaned forward, bringing my face closer to the center of the wooden table. You have absolutely no power over me anymore, Richard, I said, my voice steady, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. Before Richard could launch into another tirade, Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat. The dry sound cut through the digital connection with absolute authority. I suggest you stop speaking immediately, Richard, Mr. Caldwell advised. Your threats of litigation are entirely irrelevant, and your cease and desist order is fundamentally flawed. What are you talking about? Caldwell? Richard snapped his arrogant bravado, faltering slightly. Vanguard Holdings finalized the purchase of your firm's largest, most toxic debt portfolio from the Federal Reserve exactly 45 minutes ago, Mr. Caldwell announced casually. Lauren is not just a disgruntled daughter anymore, Richard. She is officially your primary secured creditor. The line went dead with a sharp click, leaving the soft hum of the teleconferencing system filling the room. Richard had severed the connection without a single word of rebuttal, entirely incapable of processing the reality that I now held the financial leash to his entire corporate existence. He was drowning, and instead of gracefully accepting his fate, he decided to thrash violently, desperately grasping at any floating debris he could find. 3 days later, that desperate thrashing took the form of a high society charity gala. The event was hosted at the Grand Monarch Hotel, an opulent downtown landmark famous for its crystal chandeliers and elite clientele. Brittany and her husband Cameron were the official faces of the evening, orchestrating a frantic public relations stunt masquerading as a philanthropic endeavor. Behind the masquerade, the objective was obvious. Richard and Brittany were using the glittering ballroom to corner wealthy socialites and private equity managers. They were begging for emergency bridge investors, hoping to secure fresh cash to pay off the toxic debt portfolio Vanguard Holdings now controlled. While Brittany and Cameron worked the main floor, flashing practiced smiles and pouring champagne for potential saviors, my mother Patricia was stationed at the main entrance. She stood beyond the velvet ropes wearing a floor-length emerald gown, greeting the city's wealthiest elite. I stood in the shadowed alcove near the coat check, positioned out of her line of sight, and listened as she methodically poisoned the air with my name. Patricia was speaking to wealthy real estate developers who had done business with Richard for decades. She leaned in close, pressing a manicured hand to her chest in a theatrical display of maternal sorrow. "It is just such a tragedy," Patricia whispered loudly, ensuring her voice carried to the guests waiting in line. "We tried everything to help Lauren, but she refuses to get better. People ask why she is not here tonight to support the charity, but we had no choice. She is entirely socially unfit for an event of this caliber." The older woman gasped softly, her eyes wide with scandalous delight. Patricia nodded tragically, feeding off the attention. "She has a terrible history of causing humiliating public scenes." Patricia continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You remember the country club dinner 5 years ago when she ruined the ice sculpture? She was completely out of control. We cannot risk her having another episode in front of esteemed guests. We are just praying she eventually finds the professional help she desperately needs." I listened to her weave this pathetic fictional narrative, using my past social anxiety and the very real isolation they had forced upon me as weapons to elevate her own social standing. She was painting me as a fragile, unstable outcast to explain my absence, completely unaware that I was standing less than 50 feet away. I stepped out of the shadows and walked purposefully toward the grand entrance. I was wearing a custom-tailored backless crimson gown that swept gracefully across the polished marble floor. The dress was a piece of art designed to command absolute attention without begging for it. I did not pause at the velvet ropes or wait for the host to check my name against the official guest list. I simply bypassed the barricade entirely, stepping right past the bewildered host and directly into the glowing light of the main ballroom. Patricia was mid-sentence feeding another lie to a bank executive when she caught sight of me out of the corner of her eye. Her jaw went completely slack. The fake, sorrowful smile instantly vanished from her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. She froze in place, her hand still resting on the executive's arm, staring at me as if a ghost had just walked into the hotel. I did not stop to greet her. I offered her a cool, dismissive glance and continued walking straight into the heart of the gala. The ballroom was packed with hundreds of guests, the air buzzing with clinking glasses and live jazz music. As I walked down the grand staircase, the atmosphere began to shift. Conversations naturally trailed off. Heads turned. The wealthy elite of the city, many of whom had just listened to Patricia, describe me as a fragile, socially unfit embarrassment, now watched in absolute silence as I descended the stairs with complete confidence. It did not take long for Brittany to notice the sudden change in the room's energy. She was standing near the center ice carving, desperately trying to corner a hedge fund manager when she saw the crowd parting to make way for me. Her eyes widened, her face flushing an angry, blotchy red. She immediately abandoned her potential investor and stormed across the ballroom, her husband Cameron trailing nervously behind her. Brittany intercepted me near the champagne tower, blocking my path with her arms crossed defensively over her chest. "What do you think you are doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low but vibrating with intense fury. "You are not invited, Lauren. You are trespassing at a private ticketed charity event. Turn around and walk out the front door right now before I make a scene and have you dragged out in handcuffs. I reached out and plucked a crystal flute of champagne from a passing waiter's tray. I took a slow sip, letting the expensive bubbles pop against my tongue, and looked at her with mild amusement. I do not need an invitation to walk through these doors, Brittany, I said calmly. Her eyes narrowed into furious slits. You are completely delusional. She snapped, her voice rising in pitch, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. You think just because you pulled a fast one with some debt papers that you can crash my gala and embarrass me? You are nothing but an unstable outcast. You do not belong in this room, you do not belong in this society, and you certainly do not belong at my event. Brittany aggressively snapped her fingers in the air, signaling the two large suit-clad security guards standing near the ballroom entrance. Security, she yelled, abandoning any pretense of saving face. This woman is trespassing. She has a history of causing disturbances, and she is making my guests incredibly uncomfortable. I want her physically removed from the premises immediately. Throw her out on the street where she belongs. The surrounding guests audibly gasped, stepping back to give the guards room to work. Cameron looked mortified, staring at the floor. The two heavy-set security guards quickly approached us, their faces carved from stone. Brittany crossed her arms again, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across her lips. She was practically vibrating with the anticipation of watching me get humiliated and dragged out of the building. The head of security, a tall, imposing man named Marcus, stepped directly in front of Brittany. He did not reach for my arm. He did not ask me to leave. Instead, Marcus smoothly turned his back to my sister, faced me directly, and respectfully bowed his head. "Good evening, Ms. Caldwell," Marcus said, his voice echoing clearly. "Is this woman causing a disturbance for you?" Brittany gasped. "Marcus, throw her out," she demanded frantically. The venue manager suddenly stepped forward. "I apologize, ma'am," he announced to the silent crowd, "but we do not work for you. Vanguard Holdings purchased this entire hotel last week. Ms. Caldwell is your landlord for the evening." The collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom was a physical wave of sound. The wealthy investors, socialites, and real estate moguls shifted their weight, their eyes darting between my sister's pale face and my perfectly calm expression. Brittany looked as though the air had been violently sucked from her lungs. Her jaw opened and closed silently, her eyes wide with a manic, uncomprehending terror. She looked to Marcus, the head of security, but he simply maintained his respectful posture toward me, entirely unbothered by her distress. Cameron was the first to break the agonizing tension. His survival instincts kicked in, overriding his wife's frozen state of humiliation. He grabbed Brittany by the elbow, his grip tight enough to make her flinch, and physically pulled her away from me. He leaned down, whispering harshly into her ear, his face tight with forced composure. He was reminding her why they were here. They could not afford to lose this crowd. They needed money, and they needed it tonight. Cameron forced a bright, completely artificial smile onto his face and turned to the crowd. He clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and echoing in the grand space. "Let us not get bogged down in administrative trivia," Cameron announced, his voice projecting a desperate, hearty cheerfulness. "We are here tonight to discuss the future. We are here to talk about vision, about growth, and about an unprecedented opportunity that will redefine the commercial landscape of this city." He guided a still trembling Brittany toward the front of the room, leaving me standing near the champagne tower. The crowd, hungry for a distraction from the awkward confrontation, slowly turned their attention toward the main stage. Cameron bounded up the carpeted steps with the manufactured energy of a desperate salesman. The lights in the ballroom dimmed perfectly on cue, and two massive presentation screens lowered from the ceiling on either side of the stage. Cameron grabbed a microphone from the podium and began pacing the stage. He spoke smoothly, weaving a narrative about urban revitalization and untapped market potential. He painted a picture of a revolutionary commercial development project, one that would transform a decaying industrial district into a highly profitable mixed-use metropolitan hub. It was an ambitious, incredibly detailed vision that promised massive returns for any investor smart enough to get in on the ground floor. As he spoke, the first slide appeared on the giant screens behind him. It displayed a complex financial metric chart detailing projected revenue streams against estimated construction costs. I stood near the back of the room, taking another slow sip of my champagne, and narrowed my eyes at the screen. The numbers looked strangely familiar. Cameron clicked to the next slide, revealing a detailed architectural rendering of a multi-level commercial complex. My heart gave a heavy rhythmic thud against my ribs. I knew that rendering. I knew every single line, every structural angle, every carefully calculated zoning workaround. It was not Cameron's innovative vision. It was my turnaround blueprint. I had designed that exact project 3 years ago. I had spent 6 grueling months mapping out the logistics, studying the city's zoning laws, and building a foolproof financial model. At the time, I was newly out of college and desperate for a chance to prove my worth to my family. I had taken the entire portfolio to Cameron seeking his endorsement to present it to my father. I remembered sitting in his lavish office, nervously handing over the thick binder. Cameron had flipped through the pages with a bored, condescending expression. He had barely spent 5 minutes looking at my work before tossing the binder back across his desk. He called it amateur garbage. He told me the numbers were a joke, the zoning strategy was impossible, and the entire concept was a waste of paper. He had leaned across his desk, looked me dead in the eye, and told me to stop playing business and learn my place. He had absolutely crushed my spirit that day. I had walked out of his office feeling utterly worthless, completely unaware that he had secretly kept a digital copy of my files. Now, 3 years later, Cameron was standing on a brightly lit stage presenting my garbage as his ultimate salvation. He was using my hard work, my late nights, and my intellectual property to beg for millions of dollars to save Richard's sinking empire. The sheer audacity of his theft was staggering. He was so incredibly arrogant that he believed I would never recognize my own work, or worse, that I would be too intimidated to stop him. He pointed to a specific graph on the screen, passionately explaining the brilliant tax incentives he had supposedly discovered. I watched the wealthy investors in the crowd nodding along in agreement, completely captivated by the brilliant financial strategy I had authored. Cameron was winning them over. He was wrapping his smooth, charismatic voice around my stolen ideas, and the room was buying every single word of it. The transition was instantaneous. Cameron was in the middle of a passionate sentence about his unique architectural vision when the massive screens behind him suddenly flickered. The polished, heavily branded slides he had been using vanished entirely. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd as the screens went pitch black for a fraction of a second. Then a new image illuminated the ballroom. It was the raw original title page of my commercial blueprint. The formatting was slightly less polished than Cameron's stolen version, but the data was identical. However, the most important detail was not the architectural rendering or the financial metrics. It was the bold, undeniable text displayed across the bottom of the enormous screens. The original files carried a verified embedded digital copyright timestamp from exactly 3 years ago, and printed in clear, unmissable lettering right next to that timestamp was the name of the sole author and creator of the project, Lauren Caldwell. Cameron froze on the brightly lit stage, the expensive microphone dropping slowly from his trembling lips. He turned around to look at the massive screens, his mouth falling open in silent, absolute horror. The wealthy investors in the audience began to murmur loudly, pointing at the undeniable proof of his intellectual theft. I stood perfectly, completely still, watching Cameron realize that his entire professional career was officially destroyed. The collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom was a physical wave of sound. The wealthy investors, socialites, and real estate moguls shifted their weight, their eyes darting between my sister's pale face and my perfectly calm expression. Brittany looked as though the air had been violently sucked from her lungs. Her jaw opened and closed silently, her eyes wide with a manic, uncomprehending terror. She looked to Marcus, the head of security, but he simply maintained his respectful posture toward me, entirely unbothered by her distress. Cameron was the first to break the agonizing tension. His survival instincts kicked in, overriding his wife's frozen state of humiliation. He grabbed Brittany by the elbow, his grip tight enough to make her flinch, and physically pulled her away from me. He leaned down, whispering harshly into her ear, his face tight with forced composure. He was reminding her why they were here. They could not afford to lose this crowd. They needed money, and they needed it tonight. Cameron forced a bright, completely artificial smile onto his face and turned to the crowd. He clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and echoing in the grand space. "Let us not get bogged down in administrative trivia," Cameron announced, his voice projecting a desperate, hearty cheerfulness. "We are here tonight to discuss the future. We are here to talk about vision, about growth, and about an unprecedented opportunity that will redefine the commercial landscape of this city." He guided a still trembling Brittany toward the front of the room, leaving me standing near the champagne tower. The crowd, hungry for a distraction from the awkward confrontation, slowly turned their attention toward the main stage. Cameron bounded up the carpeted steps with the manufactured energy of a desperate salesman. The lights in the ballroom dimmed perfectly on cue, and two massive presentation screens lowered from the ceiling on either side of the stage. Cameron grabbed a microphone from the podium and began pacing the stage. He spoke smoothly, weaving a narrative about urban revitalization and untapped market potential. He painted a picture of a revolutionary commercial development project, one that would transform a decaying industrial district into a highly profitable mixed-use metropolitan hub. It was an ambitious, incredibly detailed vision that promised massive returns for any investor smart enough to get in on the ground floor. As he spoke, the first slide appeared on the giant screens behind him. It displayed a complex financial metric chart detailing projected revenue streams against estimated construction costs. I stood near the back of the room, taking another slow sip of my champagne, and narrowed my eyes at the screen. The numbers looked strangely familiar. Cameron clicked to the next slide, revealing a detailed architectural rendering of a multi-level commercial complex. My heart gave a heavy, rhythmic thud against my ribs. I knew that rendering. I knew every single line, every structural angle, every carefully calculated zoning workaround. It was not Cameron's innovative vision. It was my turnaround blueprint. I had designed that exact project 3 years ago. I had spent 6 grueling months mapping out the logistics, studying the city's zoning laws, and building a foolproof financial model. At the time, I was newly out of college and desperate for a chance to prove my worth to my family. I had taken the entire portfolio to Cameron, seeking his endorsement to present it to my father. I remembered sitting in his lavish office, nervously handing over the thick binder. Cameron had flipped through the pages with a bored, condescending expression. He had barely spent 5 minutes looking at my work before tossing the binder back across his desk. He called it amateur garbage. He told me the numbers were a joke, the zoning strategy was impossible, and the entire concept was a waste of paper. He had leaned across his desk, looked me dead in the eye, and told me to stop playing business and learn my place. He had absolutely crushed my spirit that day. I had walked out of his office feeling utterly worthless, completely unaware that he had secretly kept a digital copy of my files. Now, 3 years later, Cameron was standing on a brightly lit stage, presenting my garbage as his ultimate salvation. He was using my hard work, my late nights, and my intellectual property to beg for millions of dollars to save Richard's sinking empire. The sheer audacity of his theft was staggering. He was so incredibly arrogant that he believed I would never recognize my own work, or worse, that I would be too intimidated to stop him. He pointed to a specific graph on the screen, passionately explaining the brilliant tax incentives he had supposedly discovered. I watched the wealthy investors in the crowd nodding along in agreement, completely captivated by the brilliant financial strategy I had authored. Cameron was winning them over. He was wrapping his smooth, charismatic voice around my stolen ideas, and the room was buying every single word of it. I reached into the small beaded clutch hanging from my wrist and pulled out my smartphone. As the legal owner of the Grand Monarch Hotel, my company had taken immediate control of the building's digital infrastructure. My device was already synced to the master administrative network, giving me unrestricted access to the hotel's security feeds, climate controls, and the central audio-visual system. I did not need to shout. I did not need to march up to the stage and cause the humiliating public scene my mother had so desperately tried to accuse me of. I just needed to press a few buttons. I opened the network application on my screen and quickly located the active connection feeding the dual projectors in the main ballroom. I accessed my cloud drive locating Duyen Mao 1_14.docx, Duyen Mao 2_14.docx, Duyen Mao 3_14.docx, and Duyen Mao 4_14.docx from 3 years ago. The files were perfectly preserved, locked behind layers of encryption. I selected the master presentation document. I took a deep breath, savoring the cool, crisp air of the ballroom, and tapped the override command on my phone. The transition was instantaneous. Cameron was in the middle of a passionate sentence about his unique architectural vision when the massive screens behind him suddenly flickered. The polished, heavily branded slides he had been using vanished entirely. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd as the screens went pitch black for a fraction of a second. Then a new image illuminated the ballroom. It was the raw original title page of my commercial blueprint. The formatting was slightly less polished than Cameron's stolen version, but the data was identical. However, the most important detail was not the architectural rendering or the financial metrics. It was the bold, undeniable text displayed across the bottom of the enormous screens. The original files carried a verified embedded digital copyright timestamp from exactly 3 years ago. And printed in clear, unmissable lettering right next to that timestamp was the name of the sole author and creator of the project, Lauren Caldwell. Cameron froze on the brightly lit stage, the expensive microphone dropping slowly from his trembling lips. He turned around to look at the massive screens, his mouth falling open in silent, absolute horror. The wealthy investors in the audience began to murmur loudly, pointing at the undeniable proof of his intellectual theft. I stood perfectly, completely still, watching Cameron realize that his entire professional career was officially destroyed. The silence in the ballroom did not last long. It fractured first into scattered, confused whispers, and then rapidly escalated into a loud, undeniable uproar. The elite investors, the private equity managers, and the seasoned real estate developers in the crowd were not fools. They were predators who built their fortunes on observing details, and the detail currently hovering 20 feet above the main stage was impossible to misinterpret. The digital copyright timestamp glowed a stark, brilliant white against the dark background of the presentation slide, making my name the absolute focal point of the entire room. Cameron's initial paralysis shattered, replaced by a frantic, uncoordinated panic. He began jabbing his thumb wildly against the presentation clicker in his hand, desperately trying to force the slides to advance or to shut the screens down completely. The small plastic device clicked uselessly into the microphone in his other hand, the sound completely dead. I had severed the local connection to the clicker the moment I overrode the main feed. He was entirely locked out of his own presentation, stripped of the controls he had used to mask his incompetence. He slapped the side of the clicker, his face slick with a sudden heavy sheen of sweat under the harsh stage lights. He looked out at the sea of scrutinizing faces, his manufactured charisma melting away to reveal the terrified fraud underneath. He raised the microphone to his mouth, his chest heaving as he tried to formulate some kind of excuse, some lie that could explain away the massive, glaring copyright stamp bearing his sister-in-law's name. He tapped the mesh head of the microphone, but the speakers remained dead silent. I had muted the stage audio channels directly from my phone. He was completely voiceless, left to stand in front of the city's most powerful financial figures, with absolutely no way to defend himself. Down on the main floor, Brittany stood frozen near the center aisle. The furious, indignant energy she had carried moments ago had completely evaporated. She stared up at the massive screens, her eyes darting between the complex financial metrics and the name Lauren Caldwell printed boldly at the bottom. The realization hit her with visible force. The brilliant, innovative husband she had proudly paraded in front of her social circle was nothing more than a thief who had built his reputation on the back of the sister she despised. In the front row, a prominent hedge fund manager pulled his reading glasses from his breast pocket, slipping them onto his face as he studied the screen intently. He pointed at the timestamp, leaning over to whisper urgently to the banking executive sitting beside him. They were connecting the dots, realizing that the genius turnaround strategy they had been ready to fund was stolen property. I took one final slow sip of my champagne, letting the absolute destruction of Cameron's unearned legacy unfold exactly as he deserved. The murmurs in the ballroom rapidly escalated into a chaotic symphony of outrage and disbelief. The prominent hedge fund manager who had been studying the screens stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He did not ask for an explanation or wait for Cameron to invent another lie. He simply buttoned his suit jacket, turned his back on the stage, and walked straight toward the exit. That single movement was the catalyst the rest of the room needed. Like a dam breaking, the city's most elite investors, socialites, and real estate moguls began abandoning their tables. They moved in a synchronized wave of indignation, leaving behind half-empty glasses of expensive champagne and untouched hors d'oeuvres. The grand philanthropic event, the desperate public relations stunt designed to save Richard's crumbling empire, was evaporating before my eyes. Brittany was sobbing now, standing frozen near the ice carving as the very people she had spent years courting brushed past her without a second glance. The opulent ballroom, meant to be the site of their financial salvation, had become a graveyard of their own making. I turned away from the stage, feeling the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the room begin to thin as the crowd dispersed. My objective in the main hall was complete. I began walking toward the service corridor, intending to leave the hotel through the private administrative exit. The heavy oak doors separating the ballroom from the staff areas swung shut behind me, muffling the sounds of the collapsing gala. The service corridor was dimly lit and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the crystal and silk I had just left behind. I had barely taken 10 steps down the narrow hallway when heavy, frantic footsteps echoed on the tile behind me. A hand reached out, grabbing my upper arm with a grip that was entirely devoid of its usual calculated control. The fingers dug into my skin with sheer, unrestrained panic. I did not flinch. I slowly turned my head and looked down at the hand, then moved my gaze up to meet my father's eyes. Richard looked terrible. The impeccably tailored tuxedo he wore seemed to hang loosely on his frame, as if the sheer weight of his impending ruin had physically diminished him. His face was pale, his skin slick with a cold sweat, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. The domineering, untouchable patriarch who had dictated the terms of my entire existence was gone. In his place stood a terrified, broken old man. He did not yell. He did not issue commands or attempt to intimidate me with his usual booming voice. Instead, he pulled me roughly through a set of swinging metal doors, dragging us both into the hotel's massive stainless steel industrial kitchen. The kitchen was empty, the catering staff having abandoned their stations to watch the chaos unfolding out in the ballroom. The harsh fluorescent lighting reflected off the pristine metal prep tables, casting long, sharp shadows across Richard's face. He released my arm and took a step back, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. The tough guy act had completely vanished. He looked around the sterile kitchen, his eyes darting frantically before finally settling on me. "Lauren, you have to stop this," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking with a desperate, unfamiliar vulnerability. "You have made your point. You proved that you are smarter than Cameron, that you have the capital, that you can play the game. You embarrassed us in front of the entire city. It is over. You win. Now please, you have to call off Vanguard Holdings. You have to stop the debt collection before the banks lock my accounts on Monday morning. I am begging you." I stood near a massive stainless steel sink, smoothing the fabric of my crimson gown where his fingers had wrinkled it. I watched him beg. I watched the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small, insignificant, and unworthy physically cower in front of me. I felt no triumph in his desperation, only a cold, clinical detachment. "You are begging me to save the company you built," I said slowly, my voice echoing off the metallic surfaces of the room. "The same company you explicitly barred me from entering, the same company you claimed I was too incompetent to understand." Richard took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I was wrong," he said, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a rushed, frantic stream. "I admit it. I was completely wrong about you. I underestimated you, Lauren. I see that now. You have the killer instinct I always thought you lacked. You are exactly what the business needs right now. We can fix this together. If you call off the hounds, if you stop the foreclosure process, I will restructure the executive board immediately. I will fire Cameron tonight. I will give you a guaranteed 10% ownership stake in the entire company. You will have a seat at the table. A real seat. 10% Lauren. It is a fortune. It is exactly what you have always wanted." I looked at him, my expression completely unchanging. A 10% stake in a company that is currently bleeding capital from every single artery. I replied, my tone flat and unimpressed. "A company that is entirely underwater because of your toxic debt portfolio and your absolute refusal to adapt to a modern market. You are offering me a fraction of a sinking ship, Richard. And you are offering it not out of respect for my abilities, but because you are terrified of drowning." "That is not true," Richard insisted, his voice rising in panic. "I know your worth now. I see what you are capable of doing. If you knew my worth, you would not have destroyed my first major success." I countered, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register. I stepped closer to him, closing the distance until I could see the rapid pulse beating in his neck. "3 years ago, I brought you a certified cashier's check for $50 million. I secured that funding on my own. I pitched the investors, I built the model, and I handed you the capital to save your failing commercial sector. And you took that check, Richard. You took the only undeniable proof of my competence, and you held a lighter to it. You burned $50 million of real actionable salvation while I watched. Why?" Richard recoiled as if I had physically struck him. He looked away, his eyes fixing on the tiled floor. The desperation in his posture gave way to a deep, ugly shame. For a long time, the only sound in the industrial kitchen was the low hum of the massive commercial refrigerators. "Because I could not stomach it," Richard finally whispered, his voice sounding hollow and ancient. He kept his eyes locked on the floor, unable to meet my gaze, as he confessed the toxic truth that had governed our family for decades. "I groomed Brittany from the day she was born. I poured every resource, every connection, every ounce of my influence into making her the perfect heir to my legacy. She was beautiful, she was charismatic, she was everything our society demanded. And you were just plain. You were quiet. You sat in the corner reading blueprints while she charmed the room." He finally looked up, his eyes shining with pathetic, resentful tears. "When you walked into my office with that $50 million check, you destroyed the narrative I had built my entire life around. You proved that all the money and time I wasted on Brittany was for nothing. I could not let my plain, quiet, awkward daughter hold more financial power than the golden child I had created. It would have humiliated me. It would have proven that my judgment was entirely flawed. So I burned the check. I burned it because I needed you to stay small, Lauren. I needed you to stay beneath her so I could feel like I had not failed as a father." I listened to his confession, absorbing the absolute sickening reality of his motivation. He had sabotaged his own empire, risked the livelihood of hundreds of employees, and deliberately crushed his own daughter's spirit, all to protect his fragile ego and his misguided investment in my sister. He had ruined everything, just to ensure I remained the family outcast. "I am offering you the respect you deserve now," Richard pleaded, stepping forward again, his hands clasped together. 10%, Lauren. Take the 10% and let us rebuild the family. Let us save the legacy." I looked at the man who had burned my dreams to keep me in the dark. I felt the smooth, cool leather of my beaded clutch in my hand. I slowly opened the clasp. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, legally binding document folded perfectly in thirds. "I do not want your respect, Richard. I said, my voice as cold and hard as the stainless steel tables surrounding us. And I certainly do not want your apologies. I held the document out to him. His trembling hands reached out and took the heavy paper. He unfolded it slowly. His eyes scanned the bold legal text at the top of the page, and the last remnants of color drained completely from his face. It was the formal, irrevocable foreclosure notice from Vanguard Holdings. It listed every single commercial asset he owned, every property, every holding company, and every bank account tied to his name. I am not taking 10% of your company, I told him, turning my back and walking toward the kitchen exit. I am taking 100%. The heavy metal doors of the hotel kitchen swung shut behind me, cutting off the pathetic sound of my father pleading. I walked out of the Grand Monarch Hotel and stepped into the crisp night air, leaving the absolute humiliating ruin of the gala far behind me. I hailed a private car, returned safely to my penthouse, and slept a full, uninterrupted 8 solid hours for the first time in weeks. The next morning, my phone buzzed before the sun had fully risen. It was a text message from Cameron. He asked for a highly discreet meeting at a small, independently owned coffee shop across town, far away from the financial district and the prying eyes of his usual high society circle. He claimed he had something of immense financial value to offer me this morning. I arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early. The brass bell above the wooden door chimed softly as I stepped inside. The air smelled strongly of roasted espresso beans and freshly baked pastries. I ordered a black coffee, chose a leather booth in the farthest corner, and sat facing the entrance. Exactly at 8 a.m., Cameron walked through the door. The manufactured confidence and charismatic bravado he had paraded on stage the previous night were completely gone. He wore a dark wool peacoat buttoned up to his chin and dark sunglasses, looking terrified of being recognized by the public. He scanned the room frantically, spotted me sitting in the shadowed corner, and quickly made his way over to my booth. He slid into the vinyl seat across from me, pulling off his sunglasses and placing them carefully on the table. His face was pale and dark purple bags hung heavily beneath his eyes. He had clearly not slept a single wink since fleeing the stage in humiliation. I took a slow sip of my coffee, waiting for him to speak. Cameron clasped his hands together on the wooden tabletop, leaning forward with an air of desperate conspiracy. "Lauren, thank you for agreeing to see me this morning," Cameron began, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "I know we have bad blood between us. I know what happened last night on that stage looked terrible, but you have to believe me when I say I was pushed into a tight corner. Richard was breathing down my neck for a financial miracle, and I was forced to use whatever resources I could find to secure those investors." I set my ceramic coffee cup down and looked at him with mild amusement. "You stole my intellectual property, stripped my name from the title page, and presented my exact blueprints to a room full of billionaires as your own original idea," I said evenly. "That is not being pushed into a corner, Cameron. That is calculated corporate theft, and you know it." He winced visibly, rubbing a shaking hand across his forehead. "I know exactly how it looks," he said quickly, his voice tinged with panic. "But I am not here to make excuses for my actions. I am here to make a deal. I want to offer you a mutually beneficial arrangement." Cameron reached into the deep pocket of his peacoat and pulled out a small encrypted solid-state hard drive. He placed it gently on the table between us, keeping his hand resting over it protectively. "I know you are seizing Richard's assets," Cameron whispered, his eyes darting around the empty coffee shop to ensure no one was listening to our conversation. "I know about the foreclosure notice you handed him last night in the kitchen. But Richard is a snake, Lauren. He has been illegally hiding capital from the banks, from the Internal Revenue Service, and from Vanguard Holdings. This drive contains the routing numbers, passwords, and digital ledgers for every single offshore account he controls in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. There is over $80 million hidden on this drive. It is the money he plans to use to flee the country and start over once the foreclosure is finalized." I looked down at the small metal device resting on the table, then back up at his terrified face. "And what exactly do you want from me in exchange for handing over my father's secret escape fund?" I asked. Cameron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Immunity," he pleaded. I need you to drop the copyright infringement lawsuit against me. If you take me to court for stealing those blueprints, my career is completely over. I will lose my licensing, my professional reputation, and my freedom. I am offering you $80 million of untraceable capital. In return, you just let me walk away quietly without pressing any legal charges. I leaned back in the leather booth, studying his desperate posture. You are offering to sell out Richard to save your own skin. What does Brittany have to say about this little arrangement? I asked, genuinely curious about the depths of his impending betrayal. Cameron let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He pulled his hand back from the hard drive, shaking his head slowly. Brittany does not factor into this equation, Lauren. She never really did. Our entire marriage is a complete sham. It was a business transaction orchestrated by Richard from the very beginning. I remained perfectly still, letting him speak. The coffee shop was quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the espresso machine behind the front counter. 4 years ago, my commercial development firm was on the verge of total bankruptcy. Cameron explained, his tone bitter and entirely hollow. I needed a massive capital injection, and Richard desperately wanted my firm's commercial zoning permits to expand his real estate empire into the lucrative harbor district. He called me into his office and laid out a formal contract. He agreed to absorb my firm's massive debts and grant me a high-paying executive position in his company. But the strict condition was that I had to marry Brittany. He needed to secure the corporate merger through a legal family tie, and he needed a respectable husband to manage his golden child. He treated us both like business inventory. He paraded her around like a prized asset, using her hand in marriage to close a real estate deal he could not get otherwise. Cameron looked at me, a pathetic mixture of anger and shame washing over his features. I never loved her, Lauren. I just needed the money to survive. And Richard knew it. He groomed Brittany to be the perfect corporate wife, a beautiful distraction he could trade to the highest bidder. He treated both of his daughters like literal business transactions. He isolated you because you were a threat to his fragile ego, and he sold Brittany to me because she was useful for his bottom line. I will file for divorce this afternoon. I will walk away from her, and I will walk away from Richard. Just take the drive and let me go. I looked at the hard drive, then reached across the table and picked it up. The metal casing was cold against my palm. I unlatched my leather handbag and slid the device safely inside, making sure the clasp snapped tightly shut. Thank you for this crucial evidence, Cameron. I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of sympathy. But I do not grant any immunity to thieves. I forwarded the entire copyright infringement lawsuit directly to the federal prosecutor an hour ago. Cameron sat paralyzed in the coffee shop, his mouth hanging open in silent terror. He had handed over his only leverage, realizing he was outmaneuvered before he even sat down. I did not wait for him to find his voice. I stood up, adjusted my handbag, and walked away. The encrypted hard drive resting at the bottom of my bag felt like a solid brick of truth. It was the final devastating piece of the puzzle, the absolute proof of the financial rot that had infected my family. I hailed a town car and gave the driver the address for Caldwell Enterprises. The towering glass structure had always been a monument to my father's untouchable ego. Today it was a building waiting for its new owner. High above the bustling city streets on the 40th floor, the atmosphere was a suffocating blend of panic and forced bravado. The executive boardroom was an intimidating expanse of rich mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard Caldwell stood at the head of the polished conference table. His usually immaculate appearance betrayed the frantic desperation of a man backed into a corner. His silk tie was violently loosened, and a noticeable sheen of cold perspiration coated his flushed forehead. Seated around the massive table were the 8 senior board members of his corporation. These were men who had been Richard's cronies, his golf partners, and his complicit enablers for 3 decades. They were the old guard, the staunch gatekeepers of the Caldwell Empire, summoned on zero notice for a mandatory emergency crisis meeting. Richard paced the length of the room, his leather shoes slapping against the hardwood floor. He was desperately trying to rally his troops using the booming voice he had used to intimidate competitors his entire career. He stopped pacing and slammed his fist down on the table, causing the water pitchers to rattle. We are facing a hostile takeover attempt from a predatory company, Richard barked, looking at the silent men seated around the table. Vanguard Holdings is attempting to force a mass foreclosure on our primary commercial assets, but they are relying on an administrative error we will exploit right now. We just need to vote unanimously to restructure the corporate debt portfolio this morning. We freeze all liquid assets, transfer the operational capital, and initiate a massive legal injunction. It will tie them up in federal litigation for years. We outlast them, gentlemen, like we always do. He paused, pulling a linen handkerchief from his pocket and wiping the heavy sweat from his brow. He leaned over the table, planting his palms firmly on the polished wood. I know who is operating behind Vanguard Holdings, Richard sneered, his voice dropping into a register of absolute contempt. It is my own daughter. Lauren actually believes she can march in here and steal the empire I built. She thinks because she secured a little capital, she can suddenly sit at the adults' table. But she does not understand loyalty. She does not understand how this industry works. Blood is thicker than water, gentlemen, but business is about survival. You have all been with me since the very beginning. We have weathered recessions and crushed our rivals. You are my loyal board. You are my brothers in arms. And I know you will never betray me for a little girl who plays with spreadsheets. She is an amateur throwing a temper tantrum, and we are going to vote her out of existence before the morning bell rings. Richard stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket with a final arrogant tug. He looked around the room, expecting the usual chorus of hearty agreement, the synchronized nodding of heads, and the unquestioning compliance he had demanded his entire life. Instead, he was met with a profound, chilling silence. Not a single man at the table spoke. Not a single man nodded. They simply stared at the polished mahogany surface of the table, their expressions unreadable, their hands folded neatly in front of them. The agonizing quiet stretched on for several excruciating seconds. Richard frowned, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. The absolute control he believed he possessed was suddenly inexplicably absent. Before he could demand an answer, the heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a decisive click. The sound echoed loudly in the cavernous space. Richard spun around, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage as he saw me step over the threshold. I walked into the room with slow, deliberate steps, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, my expression neutral, carrying nothing but a slim leather portfolio. "What the hell are you doing in here?" Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "This is a closed executive session. You have no authorization to be on this floor. Security. Get security up here right now." I did not stop walking. I moved gracefully down the length of the room, ignoring his frantic shouting entirely. I reached the opposite end of the conference table and stood perfectly still. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at the 8 senior board members seated along the sides. As if guided by an unseen string, every man at the table pushed their heavy leather chairs back simultaneously. The sound of wood scraping filled the room. One by one, Richard's lifelong cronies, his loyal brothers in arms, stood up. They did not look at Richard. They turned their bodies entirely toward me, standing in strict, silent respect. It was a perfectly choreographed demonstration of submission, a physical acknowledgement of the new power dynamic. Men who had previously ignored my existence now refused to even meet his gaze. They kept their eyes respectfully lowered toward the floor, waiting patiently for my instruction. The shift in loyalty was absolute and instantaneous, bought and paid for with the hard capital they valued above all else. Richard froze, his arm dropping slowly to his side. His mouth opened and closed in a silent, suffocating gasp. The arrogant defiance that had fueled his grand speech moments ago completely shattered, replaced by a hollow, uncomprehending horror. He looked at his chief financial officer, a man who had been the best man at his wedding, but the man simply kept his gaze fixed firmly on me. I placed my slim leather portfolio gently onto the smooth, polished table. "They are not going to vote for your injunction, Richard," I said quietly, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the boardroom. They are not going to freeze your assets or transfer your capital. Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked around the room at the men who had just abandoned him without speaking a single word. Why, he whispered, his voice cracking with utter defeat. Why are you standing for her? Because I bought them out, I stated, simply, watching his entire reality collapse. Late last night, while you were busy trying to figure out how to hide your money, I made each of these gentlemen an extremely lucrative, highly confidential offer. I purchased every single one of their voting shares at a massive, undeniable premium. They no longer work for you, Richard. They do not owe you their loyalty, their votes, or their time. Vanguard Holdings is the majority shareholder of Caldwell Enterprises, and I am officially taking my seat at the head of the table. The silence following my bold declaration was absolutely deafening. I walked around the massive mahogany table and pulled out the heavy leather chair at the head of the boardroom. The prestigious seat had belonged to Richard Caldwell for 30 years. I sat down, smoothing the skirt of my charcoal suit, placing my hands flat on the polished wood. The 8 senior board members remained standing for a moment longer, silently acknowledging the abrupt transfer of power before taking their respective seats. They steadfastly refused to look at Richard. He stood frozen in the far corner, his chest heaving, his pale face a portrait of pure devastation. The reality of his complete ruin had finally anchored itself deeply in his mind. He had burned my $50 million check to protect his fragile ego, and in doing so, he had handed me the exact leverage I needed to consume his entire empire. He had nothing left. No offshore accounts, no loyal board members, and absolutely no power. The empire was officially and undeniably mine. Before Richard could muster the strength to speak, a sudden frantic commotion erupted in the reception area. The muffled sound of a receptionist desperately trying to halt someone was immediately followed by a violent crash. The heavy double doors were shoved open with such immense force that they slammed against the interior walls. Brittany stood in the threshold looking unhinged. Her blonde hair was tangled, falling around her tear-streaked face. She clutched a thick manila envelope in her shaking hand, her chest rising in erratic gasps. She looked wildly around the room, her manic eyes skipping right over me and landing directly on our father. She sprinted across the room toward him, ignoring the board members watching her sudden intrusion with shock. "You have to fix this right now!" Brittany screamed, shoving the manila envelope into Richard's chest. "Do you hear me? I was at the boutique on Fifth Avenue and my black card was declined. I handed them the platinum card and that declined too. The manager looked at me like I was a street beggar. He cut the cards up right in front of me. Then a courier walked right into the store and handed me this. It is from Cameron. He is divorcing me. He filed the paperwork this morning and locked me out of the penthouse. He canceled every single account we share. He left me with nothing. You need to call the bank and authorize a wire transfer. I need cash and I need you to destroy Cameron for doing this." Richard simply stared as the envelope fell from Brittany's hand, the legal divorce documents spilling onto the hardwood floor. He looked at his eldest daughter, the golden child he had sacrificed everything to build up, with a vacant expression. He had absolutely nothing to give her. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized, and his company no longer belonged to him. Brittany let out a hysterical shriek. She grabbed his arm, shaking him violently. "Are you deaf?" Brittany yelled, her face turning red. "Call the bank." Richard slowly turned his head and looked toward the head of the table. Brittany followed his defeated gaze, finally registering who was sitting in the chairman's seat. The manic energy drained out of her, replaced by profound confusion. She looked at the silent board members, then back at me. I sat perfectly still, watching her meltdown with detached satisfaction. "What is she doing in your chair?" Brittany demanded. "Why is Lauren sitting there? Get her out of here. Tell security to drag her out." "She is not moving," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "She bought them out. Vanguard Holdings owns the company. We have nothing left, Brittany. She took it all." Brittany stared at him in silent shock. The words refused to penetrate the thick armor of entitlement she had worn her entire life. She looked from Richard to the board members, searching their faces for a denial. But the men averted their eyes. The realization hit her slowly. The unlimited bank accounts, the endless shopping sprees, the lavish vacations, the entire lifestyle she had taken for granted, it was all completely gone. Her confusion rapidly boiled over into irrational fury. She turned toward me, marching down the length of the conference table until she was standing just a few feet away. She slammed both hands down on the mahogany surface, leaning over so her face was inches from mine. "You undo this right now!" Brittany snarled, her voice vibrating with toxic rage. "You give him back the company. You owe me this. Do you understand me? You owe me. I am the older sister. I am the one who was meant to inherit this lifestyle. I am the rightful heir to the Caldwell name. You were always just the plain background decoration. You were meant to stay out of my way and let me shine. You do not get to walk in here and steal my life." She paced back and forth, waving her arms frantically. "You are going to write me a check," she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "I need a bailout. I need capital to secure a lawyer to fight Cameron, and I need money to maintain my standard of living. You are going to give me a massive cash allowance today. You ruined my husband's presentation, humiliated me in front of my friends, and now stolen my family's money. You owe me a bailout, Lauren. It is your absolute duty to fix this mess." I sat back in the leather chair, letting her hysterical demands wash over me. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of defense. I just watched her unravel. She had spent her entire existence believing the world owed her a premium experience simply because she was born. She had never worked a hard day in her life. She had never built anything or earned anything of substance. She had simply existed as a parasite on my father's stolen wealth, and now she was suffocating. The board members watched the display with naked disgust. The woman they had previously treated with fawning respect was now throwing a temper tantrum like a spoiled toddler in the middle of a corporate boardroom. I slowly reached out and unzipped my leather portfolio. The sound of the zipper cut through the tense, heavy air. I reached inside and pulled out a silver fountain pen. Then I pulled out a single crisp sheet of white paper. I placed the paper on the mahogany table and set the silver pen gently on top of it. Brittany stopped pacing. She stared at the paper, her eyes narrowing in greedy anticipation. She genuinely believed I was pulling out a checkbook. She believed that her screaming her demands and her twisted logic had actually worked. She took a step closer, ready to snatch the money from the table. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the paper and slid it slowly across the polished surface of the table. It came to a stop directly in front of her. Brittany reached out and snatched the paper, her eyes scanning the top line, her face contorted in absolute revulsion as if she were holding something physically toxic. She dropped the paper back onto the table, staring at me in horrified disbelief. It was not a check. It was a standard 2-page employment application for Vanguard Holdings. I looked up at her, meeting her terrified, angry eyes with a steady, unbreakable gaze. "That is an application for an entry-level position in the mailroom of my company," I said quietly, my voice radiating absolute authority. "You will be sorting incoming packages, filing basic invoices, and fetching coffee for the junior analysts. The starting salary is $40,000 a year, and you will receive a standard 2 weeks of paid vacation." Brittany opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. "You want money?" I asked, my tone deadly calm. "Start from the bottom just like I did." Brittany stared at the single sheet of paper as if the thick white parchment might suddenly burst into flames. Her perfectly glossed lips trembled uncontrollably, and her wide eyes darted frantically around the expansive room, desperately searching for someone, anyone, to intervene on her behalf. But the board members simply watched her in absolute silence, their expressions entirely devoid of pity or sympathy. She looked down at the entry-level mailroom clerk application, again let out a choked, breathless sob of pure humiliation, and practically threw the paper back onto the polished table. Without another word, she turned and fled the boardroom, the frantic clicking of her designer heels echoing down the marble corridor as she ran from the harsh reality she was completely unequipped to handle. I turned my attention back to the man standing in the corner of the room. Richard had watched his golden child crumble and flee, and the pathetic sight seemed to finally snap whatever fragile tether he had left to his sanity. His face, previously pale with shock and defeat, suddenly flooded with a deep, furious shade of purple. He stepped away from the wall, his chest heaving with ragged, uneven breaths that sounded loud in the quiet space. He glared at me, sitting comfortably in his custom leather chair at the head of his massive conference table, surrounded by the powerful men he had commanded for decades. "I am not leaving this chair," Richard growled, his voice a low, gravelly threat that vibrated through the heavy silence. "You are not taking my seat today, and you are certainly not taking my company. This is my empire, Lauren. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Caldwell Enterprises, and I will never be replaced by an ungrateful, vindictive little girl." He marched aggressively toward the head of the table, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. I remained perfectly still, watching his hostile approach with mild, detached curiosity. The senior board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, several of them bracing themselves against the table in case the disgraced executive suddenly became physically violent. But Richard did not reach for me. Instead, his wild eyes locked onto the leather portfolio I had placed so carefully on the mahogany surface. It contained the finalized, legally binding takeover documents, the formal transfer of all voting shares, and the absolute foreclosure execution orders. With a sudden guttural roar of pure desperation, Richard lunged forward across the expensive wood. He swept his arm violently across the table, knocking heavy water pitchers and crystal drinking glasses to the floor in a loud shower of shattering glass and splashing ice. He grabbed the thick stack of documents from my open portfolio, clutching the important papers to his chest like a sinking man clinging to a life preserver. "You actually think these pieces of paper mean anything?" Richard shouted, spit flying from his lips as he stumbled backward away from the table. "You think a few signatures can erase 30 years of my blood, my sweat, and my absolute dedication to this firm? I will destroy this right now. I will erase this entire hostile takeover from existence." He spun around and staggered toward the far corner of the boardroom where a heavy-duty commercial-grade paper shredder sat next to a carved mahogany credenza. He jammed his trembling finger onto the main power switch. The large machine hummed to life with a low, menacing growl. Richard began ripping the thick stack of legal documents apart, shoving hasty handfuls of the heavy parchment down into the grinding metal teeth. "I built this empire from nothing." He screamed over the loud mechanical churning of the shredder. "I started with absolutely nothing, Lauren. I built this entire global corporation with my own two bare hands. I negotiated the impossible deals. I crushed our competition into dust. I forged this massive legacy out of pure raw ambition and sheer willpower. You have zero right to walk in here and claim what I created entirely from scratch." I stood up slowly from the leather chair. I watched the shredded remnants of the takeover documents spill into the clear plastic collection bin, completely unbothered by his frantic, useless destruction. My legal team already possessed multiple certified digital records and physical copies of every single page he was currently destroying. His pathetic actions were nothing more than a symbolic, highly entertaining temper tantrum. "You built absolutely nothing from scratch, Richard," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly over the noisy grinding of the shredding machine. "You seem to have conveniently forgotten exactly where your initial seed capital came from. You did not start this business with nothing. You started with Grandpa Theodore's vast family fortune. He handed you a massive multi-million-dollar trust fund to launch this firm. He gave you his extensive network of political contacts, his pristine professional reputation, and his highly lucrative commercial real estate portfolio. You took an established, thriving foundation, and you used it exclusively to fund your massive ego. You squandered his incredible legacy on terrible investments, reckless corporate mergers, and a lavish lifestyle you could never actually afford to maintain." Richard froze, a thick clump of half-torn legal papers still clutched tightly in his trembling, sweating hand. He glared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, completely unhinged by the harsh, unfiltered truth he had spent decades trying to suppress. Theodore was a stubborn relic. Richard snarled aggressively, shoving the rest of the papers into the loud machine. He did not have the modern vision to take this regional company to the international level. I expanded our global operations. I made the Caldwell family name actually mean something important. You drove the company directly into a massive, impenetrable wall of debt. I corrected him, taking a slow, measured step around the conference table. You illegally hid operating capital in the Cayman Islands while your domestic commercial properties went into federal foreclosure. You actively sold out your own daughters, treating us like expendable business inventory to secure private loans and cover your massive financial failures. And now the stolen money is entirely gone. The corporate board has firmly turned against you. The Caldwell empire is officially over. Shut up! Richard bellowed violently, slamming his closed fist against the hard plastic top of the running shredder. Shut your ungrateful mouth right now. I am still the only person in control here. I am still the legal owner of this commercial building. I will have you forcibly and physically removed for criminal trespassing. I will personally sue you for corporate espionage and intellectual theft. I will drag you through the federal court system until you have absolutely nothing left to your name. Suddenly, heavy commanding footsteps echoed loudly down the marble hallway, instantly shattering his final desperate outburst. The 8 senior board members all turned their heads simultaneously. The large, heavy mahogany doors were suddenly pushed wide open, revealing 2 serious uniformed police officers. They were not here for any simple corporate disturbance. The lead officer stepped inside the quiet room, raising a document. Richard Caldwell, the officer announced firmly. We have a warrant for your immediate arrest regarding massive bank fraud and the execution of a completely forged power of attorney document. You have the right to remain silent, but place your hands clearly behind your back right now because you are going straight to federal prison for a very long time starting today. Richard's legs gave out. The weight of the officer's words severed his knees. He sagged against the paper shredder, his mouth opening like a suffocating fish. The officers moved forward with practiced efficiency. One grabbed Richard's trembling wrist, twisting his arm behind his back. Richard let out a pathetic whine as the steel bit into his skin. The arrogant corporate titan who had terrorized this company was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken old man facing the absolute ruin of his life. The board members watched the swift arrest with detached expressions. Not a single man stood up to defend him. They averted their eyes, calculating how to distance their reputations from the spectacular collapse of their former leader. While the officers began reciting the Miranda rights, a desperate movement at the far end of the room caught my attention. The heavy doors leading to the rear service elevator were slowly inching open. Patricia was trying to escape. My mother had apparently slipped into the boardroom during Brittany's hysterical meltdown, lingering quietly in the shadows. She clutched her pale pink designer handbag tightly to her chest. Her expensive heels lifted slightly off the floor to muffle her footsteps. Her eyes darted frantically toward the exit, solely focused on preserving herself. She reached a trembling hand toward the brass doorknob, slipping halfway into the shadowed hallway. Suddenly, an imposing figure stepped directly into the doorway, completely blocking her path. It was Mr. Caldwell, my grandfather Theodore's younger brother and the original executor of the family trust. Arthur Caldwell had been forced out of the company by Richard decades ago, exiled from the empire he helped build because he had questioned Richard's reckless spending. Now he stood blocking my mother's cowardly retreat. Arthur looked down at Patricia with an expression of profound disgust. He pulled a bundle of legal summons from his folder, pressing them firmly against Patricia's chest until she was forced to take them. You are not going anywhere, Patricia, Arthur said, his voice echoing with years of suppressed anger. You are being officially served. These are federal summons for your knowing complicity in the trust fund theft. We have the banking records. We have your signature on the offshore wire transfers. You knowingly helped Richard funnel my brother's legacy into hidden accounts to maintain your lavish lifestyle. Your assets are officially frozen as of 10 minutes ago. You will be appearing in federal court alongside your husband. Patricia stared at the legal papers in her hands, her eyes wide with horror. Her reaction was immediate and entirely revealing. She did not look at Richard, who was currently being hoisted to his feet by the police officers. She did not cry out for her husband or ask what would happen to him. Instead, a shrill, piercing wail tore from her throat. "Are you insane?" Patricia shrieked, her perfectly manicured facade crumbling into absolute hysteria. "Do you have any idea what this is going to do to me?" The annual charity gala is next month. I am the chairwoman of the committee. If I am named in a federal fraud lawsuit, the country club board will strip me of my title before lunch. My entire social circle will exile me. I will be an absolute pariah. You cannot do this to my reputation. I have spent 30 years building my social standing. I cannot be associated with a criminal investigation. It will destroy my entire life. She was hyperventilating, consumed by the impending loss of her superficial world. Her husband was wearing handcuffs, her eldest daughter was currently sobbing over a mailroom application, and her empire was burning to the ground. But Patricia could only weep for her country club memberships. It was the ultimate proof that her priorities had never once shifted from the shallowest possible concerns. She valued her public image far more than she valued her family, her integrity, or her own flesh and blood. I stood at the head of the conference table, watching the miserable remnants of my family falling apart. The board members were silent. Arthur stood guard at the door, and the police officers were preparing to march Richard toward the exit. I picked up my leather portfolio. It was time to finally close the book on the Caldwell family's toxic reign. I turned to the head of corporate security, who had quietly entered the room behind the police officers. "Do not let them use the private executive elevator," I instructed, my voice ringing out with chilling clarity. "They no longer have executive privileges in this building. Escort Richard, Patricia, and Brittany out through the main public lobby. Make sure they walk right through the center of the atrium." Richard's head snapped up, his face draining of whatever color remained. "No," he begged, his voice a pathetic whisper. "Lauren, please. The local news crews have been camping outside the building since the stock plummeted this morning. If you send us out the front doors, they will broadcast it live. Please do not humiliate me like this. Use the service exit. I am begging you." I looked at the man who had spent his entire life humiliating me, degrading my hard work and stealing my future. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no anger, no sadness. Just a profound, quiet emptiness. "You humiliated yourself, Richard," I said coldly. "Take them out right now." The security guards moved forward, grabbing Patricia by the elbow as the police officers shoved Richard toward the double doors. I stood at the expansive glass windows of the boardroom, looking down at the bustling city streets far below. A few moments later, the front doors of the building swung open. A swarm of reporters and flashing cameras immediately engulfed my parents and my sister as they were paraded out onto the concrete pavement. The bright flashbulbs illuminated their terrified, ruined faces for the entire world to see. The family empire was officially dead, and my life was finally mine. The heavy oak doors of the executive office clicked shut behind me, sealing off the distant, muffled echoes of the police sirens fading into the city streets. I stood in the center of the room that had served as the undisputed seat of power for Caldwell Enterprises over the last 3 decades. The air inside still smelled faintly of Richard's expensive cologne and imported cigars, a lingering residue of the arrogance that had just been so thoroughly dismantled. I walked slowly toward the massive mahogany desk, my heels sinking slightly into the plush Persian rug. The surface of the desk was entirely clear, stripped of the frantic legal papers and fabricated financial projections Richard had desperately relied on to maintain his illusion of wealth. The only item remaining was a heavy brass nameplate resting near the edge. I reached out and picked up the cold metal block. It bore Richard Caldwell's name in deep, elegant engraving, followed by his title as Chief Executive Officer. I held it for a brief moment, feeling the substantial weight of it in my palm. Then, with a smooth, effortless motion, I dropped the heavy brass plate directly into the metal trash can beside the desk. It landed with a loud, satisfying thud, a perfectly fitting conclusion to his reign of manipulation and unchecked greed. The door to the office opened quietly, and Arthur Caldwell stepped inside. The older man looked remarkably relaxed. The tight lines of stress that had surrounded his eyes for years finally smoothed away. He carried a thick leather folder under his arm, and a genuine warm smile spread across his weathered face as he took in the sight of me standing behind the executive desk. "It is done," Arthur said, his voice rich with quiet satisfaction. "The police have officially processed the arrest warrants, and the federal courts have frozen every single one of their domestic and international accounts. I just spoke with our legal team downstairs." Arthur walked over to the desk and unclasped the leather folder. He drew out a stack of heavy watermarked documents and spread them across the polished mahogany surface. "These are the finalized, irrevocable deeds," he explained, tapping the thick parchment with his index finger. "The transfer of the entire commercial real estate empire is fully executed. Vanguard Holdings is the sole proprietor, and this second stack contains the restored deeds to your grandfather Theodore's original private estate, completely cleansed of Richard's toxic liens and fraudulent mortgages. The properties, the liquid capital, and the corporate voting shares are officially yours. You saved the legacy, Lauren." I looked down at the physical proof of my victory. The paper trail of my father's ruin was completely eclipsed by the ironclad documents securing my future. "Thank you for standing by me, Arthur," I said softly. "I could not have navigated the board without your institutional knowledge of his old guard." Arthur waved away the compliment and walked over to the antique crystal wet bar situated against the far wall. He selected 2 heavy tumbler glasses and poured a generous measure of aged single malt scotch into each one. He walked back to the desk, handing one of the crystal glasses to me, before raising his own in a silent salute. "You do not need to thank me," Arthur replied, taking a slow sip of the amber liquid. "I have waited a very long time to see that man face the actual consequences of his actions, but I have to admit the sheer brilliance of the Vanguard strategy still amazes me. Theodore always said you inherited his analytical mind, but the execution of this trap was nothing short of extraordinary." I swirled the scotch in my glass, watching the light catch the golden liquid. "It was not entirely my design," I admitted, leaning against the edge of the mahogany desk. "Grandpa Theodore laid the groundwork for this before he died. He knew exactly what Richard was capable of, and he knew my father's insatiable greed would eventually become his absolute undoing." Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a deep, knowing understanding. "Theodore set that $50 million trust aside specifically because he knew Richard would burn through the company's legitimate operating capital. He intentionally left the back door open in the corporate bylaws, knowing your father would eventually attempt to secure unauthorized predatory loans to cover his tracks. Theodore knew Richard would be so blinded by the sudden influx of cash from a faceless entity like Vanguard Holdings that he would never bother to investigate the actual source of the funds. He relied on Richard's fundamental lack of respect for me." I added, my voice steady and clear. "Richard never once believed I was capable of building my own wealth. He spent his entire life telling me I was a disappointment, an amateur who belonged in the background. Because he refused to see my potential, he never saw the trap closing around him. He gladly signed his empire away to a ghost completely unaware that his discarded daughter was holding the pen." Arthur smiled, raising his glass once more. "To Theodore's vision," he said warmly, "and to the new chief executive officer." I clinked my glass against his, the crystal chiming brightly in the quiet office. "To the truth," I replied. Arthur finished his drink and offered a respectful nod before quietly exiting the office, leaving me alone in the expansive space. I set my glass down on the polished desk and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that dominated the northern wall. The late morning sun was burning off the last remnants of the coastal fog, casting a brilliant golden light over the sprawling Boston skyline. The city looked remarkably vibrant and incredibly alive, a sharp contrast to the suffocating past. I had completely dismantled the toxic family structure that had tried to crush me, finally securing my grandfather's true legacy. Bringing my own empire into the light was an absolute, deeply satisfying triumph. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect and uplift you are the very ones holding you down. We are often taught that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred loyalty that demands our constant sacrifice. But loyalty should never be a one-way street paved with your own self-worth. When you spend your entire life trying to earn a seat at a table where you were never truly welcome, you eventually realize that the only viable solution is to build an empire of your own. You absolutely do not have to accept the narrative that toxic people have written for you, especially when that narrative is specifically designed to keep you small, compliant, and underestimated. True power does not come from throwing loud tantrums or begging for respect from those who are entirely incapable of giving it. True power is profoundly quiet. It is the steady, relentless dedication to your own growth while everyone else is distracted by their own vanity and greed. When they overlook you, let them. Use that complete invisibility as your greatest strategic advantage. Build your knowledge, secure your absolute independence, and simply wait for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows. Justice rarely comes from shouting your truth at people who are completely committed to misunderstanding you. True justice comes from allowing the natural consequences of their own arrogant behavior to inevitably catch up with them while you stand firmly on the solid foundation you built with your own two hands. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family expectations to build a life entirely on your own terms? How did you finally break free and find your own success? Share your story in the comments below. If this journey of reclaiming power and finding sweet justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about turning ultimate betrayal into absolute triumph.